When I was young and dumb, one of the favorite games for my juvenile mind was Star Wars Battlefront 2. Being a soldier on the battlefield of the Star Wars universe drew me in as a kid. Now that I'm an adult, and still dumb, I decided to revisit the Battlefront games. Even though the reviews for them were never marvelous, and the games themselves are over 10 years old, people seem to reflect upon them fondly. When DICE's 2015 Battlefront launched to less than stellar reception, people were quick to compare it to the originals, seemingly just off memories over a decade old. What made these people revere the mid-2000s Battlefront games so fondly? Was it nostalgia? Inherently great quality? What makes the mid-2000s Battlefront games so memorable for so many people? Well, to start off negatively, it certainly isn't any deep skill-based mechanics. Every action is pretty simple, and the combat itself is pretty basic. Look at an enemy, hit shoot button. Sometimes you use a special gadget of some sort, but for the most part, it's just point and click. Projectile-based weapons make it so moving while shooting is the best way to engage an enemy, that way you're dodging their lasers and such. So, while there's some skill in that, there's still not much in the way of depth to anything related to combat. Rather, I think the enjoyment of the combat and the games in general come from the sheer scale and variety of it all. Despite being in the laser-heavy Star Wars universe, all the playable infantry factions feel distinct from one another. Each faction has 5 classes in Battlefront 1 and 6 in BF2. There's an all-round infantry class, a dedicated anti-armor class, a demo man, repairman, medic, fucks over the indentation in my script guy, a sniper, and then 2 unique classes to each faction. While the design philosophy for each of the basic classes is pretty simple, an anti-infantry class, an anti-tank class, a close-range class, and then a long-range class, the important thing to note is none of the classes are redundant with each other, to the point where only one of the infantry classes has the iconic blaster rifle. To give examples, if I pick the basic blaster rifle trooper prevalent in all the movies, I'll be duking it out with enemy infantry head-on. Playing as the AT soldier will have me sifting for vehicles and trying to avoid swarms of infantry. Choosing the engineer will have me using cover to get as close as possible in order to use my close-range shotgun, explosive, and other saboteur tools. If I pick the sniper, I'll likely be sticking to raised areas to get a good vantage point far away from the enemy. Then there's the 2 unique classes each faction has, which might have me flying around with a jetpack, harassing the enemy with an EMP launcher from above. Or have me playing as a droideka, rolling around and fighting more like a miniature tank than a regular foot soldier. If I get bored of one playstyle, I can just switch classes that will put me in a radically different role. Even if the mechanics themselves are bare bones, having a variety in weapons and playstyles, rather than just having a couple dozen slight variations of the same equipment, can break the monotony up. This attribute of diversity is also applicable to the vehicles and maps in the game. All vehicles have a very simple moveset. Most have 2 attacks, some only 1. Every vehicle has a turbo mode of some sort that increases the vehicle's velocity in exchange for maneuverability, and some have additional seats for passengers that might have a weapon for the passenger to fire. While the description I gave is applicable to all vehicles, it doesn't mean all the vehicles feel the same. Like infantry, vehicles have multiple classes. There's slow, heavy walkers that act as mobile spawn points, tanks, lightly armored assault vehicles, and then quick, vulnerable transport craft. There's a clear distinction between faction vehicles, both visually and gameplay-wise. Let's take a look at the clone and droid main battle tank, for example. Both hover, both move at the same speed and have the same health, both have a basic heavy laser and an alternate rocket attack, and both have a turret for a passenger to occupy. Even though both are largely copies of each other, the developers at least made them obviously visually distinct, and made the turrets operate differently for each vehicle. The turret in the Confederate tank fires a high-damaging single shot with long pauses between shots, while a clone turret fires a moderately damaging laser beam that deals more and more damage the longer the beam is held on target. The turret of the droid vehicle is enclosed, protecting the gunner, while the clone trooper tank's turret is open, leaving the gunner vulnerable. This really isn't anything special, but it prevents factions from feeling too uniform. Giving every vehicle its own special trait gives the player an incentive to try every vehicle, and prevents factions from just feeling like reskin versions of each other. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but this design of abundant varied content can be applied to the maps as well. Maps in Battlefront usually have at least 1 to 2 gimmicks to differentiate them from other maps. I feel as if the best way to support this claim is to give yet more examples. For the sake of brevity, and my lack of effort, I'm just going to cover the 4 close quarter maps from Battlefront 2, that way you get the gist of it. Starting with Coruscant's ruined Jedi Temple, the edges of the map are filled with many small rooms and long corridors, while there's just one massive room in the center. Since spawn points are placed in the small outlet rooms, players are funneled into the massive center room, so there's always a sizable battle going on. If one side takes the center room, they've effectively won the match, since they've isolated the enemy to one or two small rooms with spawn points in them. The opposite of this would be Tactic 4, which has main spawn points for each faction on separate sides of the map in giant open rooms, requiring players to move through long, narrow hallways in order to take map control. Engagements between combatants will mostly be at the end of these cramped long corridors, ideal for players that can throw a good nade. The Polis Massa Medical Facility follows a similar design to Coruscant, except the outside arena is space, meaning the arena is even more massive and will only be done by vehicles unless the player wants to slowly suffocate to death. If the player is struggling with, or just dislikes, the quarter combat, then they can just get inside a tank and try to engage enemy vehicles outside in the vastness of space combat on an asteroid. I like the duplicity on this map. There's an infantry-only battle going on in the inside, and a tank-only battle going on in the outside. Both the long interior hallways and outside space arena lead to the enemy tank hangars, which double as capture points. Each side is only required to win either the infantry battle or the tank battle outside in order to cap the points and win the match. Finally, we have the Death Star. The Death Star would feel redundant with the other maps, with its long, narrow platforms and all, if it weren't for the fact that half the map is a bottomless pit. Necessitating that the player mind their footwork, or suffer falling into the dark abyss, makes the Death Star my favorite map of the four. There's only so much that can be done to make close quarters combat feel different from map to map, but the devs managed it, which I feel is commendable. There's some prominent gameplay trait for each map, while also looking aesthetically unique. It'd be incredibly repetitive if the only facet to distinguish maps from each other was the graphical assets they use and not some exclusive gameplay traits. Keep in mind, I only mentioned the interior maps, which constitute a meager 4 of the 29 maps between Battlefront 1 and 2. Designers knew how to morph the terrain and create choke points, as well as placing vehicles and interactive turrets and switches in the environment to control how engagements would play out. A few maps are misses. Don't think I'm some zealot that loves everything about these games. Personally, I'm not a fan of the Felicia and Dagobah maps, which are open, fog-filled arenas with little cover. I find that not being able to see is more irritating than anything else, and the lack of choke points leads to small and focused battles. Even though I dislike those maps, there's still over 25 other maps for me to play on. Not every map is going to connect with the player, but the sheer variety in gameplay and aesthetic is conducive to every player at least enjoying a few maps. For a final example, when the devs are at the top of their game, they make a map like Geonosis, which exemplifies everything I've mentioned so far. Aesthetically, the only other map like this is Mos Eisley, and gameplay-wise, Geonosis is completely unique. Though the classes for each faction never change from map to map, the skins of certain factions can change depending on the planet. The clones on Geonosis get a completely different model from every other map. There's 4 vehicles in this level, half of which are exclusive just to this level. The Clone Trooper ATT is a stubby, slow, heavy transport that acts as a mobile spawn point. The droids receive a light, quick, large-brimmed rocket assault vehicle, unlike anything else in the game. Pre-placed turrets around the map have their own distinct sound, model, and projectile. The droids have their own unique AI-controlled ally, these repugnant bug creatures, which are one of only 3 flying units in the game. The map is open, but with a few bunkers to take cover in. The most massive hill in the whole game resides on this map, serving as a capture point and a great sniping position. All this leads to a map where running out as a lone infantryman will only serve to get you killed. Victory on Geonosis involves a lot of strategic movement and utilizing everything on the map for a lot of combined arms gameplay. It seems like the dev put in as many concepts as they could in the time frame they had to create these games, knowing at least some of it would stick. It doesn't sound too graceful, but it worked. Referring back to Geonosis, if I don't enjoy playing as one of the vehicles, then there's 3 more to pick from. If I don't enjoy any of the vehicle combat, then I can play as an infantryman and run from bunker to bunker, capping points along the way. If I don't enjoy blitzing through the center of the map, then I can man the map's unique turret. If I don't enjoy the static gameplay of a turret, then I can flank up the giant bunker hill on the east end of the map for a high vantage point. Not all maps are quite as exceptional as Geonosis, but I believe it demonstrates a probable design philosophy the developers had. If you can't go deep, go wide. Shooting mechanics in a shooter don't have to be deep if there are other draws to the game, such as the sheer multitude of content. It's only when bare-bones mechanics are combined with a lack of varied content that issues arise. The games are obviously not without their flaws. Unfortunately, both Battlefront games have numerous bugs and, most noticeably, poor AI. Be aware that a lot of these bugs and AI issues are annoyances and the game would be better if they're fixed, but some of them, funny enough, make the game more memorable. The AI barely does anything complex and has a bad tendency to ignore you shooting at it sometimes, but there are some genuinely hilarious moments with it. I've always loved how a rebel soldier will run up to an enemy's corpse and shoot it with a pistol right after the hostile dies. I don't know why it's just the rebels that do it, or why it's always that they use their pistol to shoot the corpse with, but it's fucking funny. I didn't capture any footage of this part, but the rebel will actually team kill his fellow soldier if his comrade obstructs his ability to shoot the corpse. It's bizarre. Certain vehicles in the first Battlefront had some very wonky controls, and by that I mean you couldn't control them at all. It was completely impractical to use these vehicles for combat, but it gave a good chuckle when you saw an AI tank doing barrel rolls in the corner of the map. I don't want to make an excuse for the bugs and the crappy AI these games have, but they do warrant a giggle every so often. The series carried a lot of momentum during its releases. Battlefront was a successful game, selling nearly 4 million copies, and Battlefront 2 sold even more. BF2 was just about everything an iterative sequel should be, with quality of life improvements and expanding upon the previous game's content. Several changes from Battlefront 1 to Battlefront 2 include an improved UI, placing more important information at the center of the screen rather than off to one of the corners as Battlefront 1 did. Sprint and stamina functions were added, allowing soldiers to move quicker on the battlefield, decreasing downtime between engagements. Heroes were in BF1 but were controlled by the AI. BF2 not only made heroes playable, but also greatly expanded their movesets, making them far more interesting than if they had just been straight ports from Battlefront 1. The Galactic Conquest mode was formally interacted with through a static, unengaging menu. Battlefront 2 turned this into a neat little map, making the game mode's premise less abstract. Game mode customization was greatly increased, with the user now able to customize battle size, length, and turn on and off certain gameplay facets. An XL game mode was added, which pitted forces of 128 soldiers against each other on the game's largest maps. Finally, and probably the most predominant feature tallied on, BF2 added space battles. Battlefront 1 had spaceships, but they were forced to fight in these small, cramped maps, and didn't integrate well with the ground gameplay. Not only did the sequel expand the ship's classes and abilities, but it gave them their own fully fleshed out maps and game modes. The claustrophobic ship battles in the original game were now on spacious space maps, with highly mobile dogfights emerging as a result. Massive flagships were added that were to be gradually eviscerated as the battle raged on, whether it be bombing the enemy flagship, intercepting enemy bombers, getting into dogfights, landing a boarding party, or watching the suicidal AI show off its complete and utter competence. There was shit to do in the space battles. There's also a lot of freedom in the game mode. The player wasn't arbitrarily handed objectives to give them something to do. The player decides how to disable the enemy flagship in whatever way they see fit. Even though BF2 did reuse a lot of the assets from the first game, it nearly made the first game look antiquated. Content from BF1 could even be downloaded into BF2 thanks to how moddable the game was. The series garnered a feeling of progress. The limited Battlefront 3 footage we have access to shows the series becoming even more grand in scale, with space and ground battles finally being merged together. This logical progression hyped people up, and kept them hyped even well after Battlefront 3's unfortunate cancellation. This brings me to the very last point of the video, and that is that Battlefront feels like a gamer's game. And by that I mean not some bullshit marketing cash grab. It's incredibly easy to boot the game, select the game mode and the settings you want, and then get into a game. It takes less than 30 seconds to do all of this, even when booting the game up for the first time. This game doesn't start by throwing you into some forced tutorial and attempt to make you to admire and be put in awe by its oh so amazing graphics. The UI doesn't look graceful at all, but it's pragmatic, preventing frustrations with it. After dying, selecting a command point and respawning is a matter of seconds. All content is unlocked from the get-go without any persistent grind, requiring dozens of hours of play to unlock everything. Random mini-game modes were thrown in, being created from cobbled together assets. Probably didn't take much time to make these, but they're entertaining additions. Comprehensive tutorials are present, but the player selects them at his or her own leisure, avoiding them completely if they so desire. There's a severe lack of bullshit, and I feel like if Battlefront was reskinned into a non-Star Wars game, it would still have assembled a loyal fan base and some praise. Indubitably wouldn't have sold as much, but achieved some form of acclaim nonetheless. Let me know your opinions down in the comments, start some discussion going. Maybe talk about how the old Battlefront isn't quite dead, with Battlefront 2's multiplayer being resurrected the day I finished writing this video. This video took longer than expected to make, because I'm fucking lazy, so I'm interested in what your thoughts on it are. Whatever you do, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I hope you tune in for the next one.